So stars that evolve off the main sequence to either horizontal branch or red giants. Turns out that the normal star is on the main sequence and it's very, very stable, but that at certain temperatures and pressures that these layers can be very close to being very small changes in pressure and temperature can make them the difference between passing light through them or not passing light, whether they're transparent or opaque to certain kinds of radiation. That would make stars pulsate. Now, we talked about pulsating variables back when we were talking with the HR diagram, and I alluded to the fact that your book talks about this in a later chapter. Well, this is actually that later chapter, chapter 19, and it discusses the idea that stars in a certain region of the HR diagram, that stars that are in that part of the HR diagram tend to be unstable because they alternate between these layers that expand and contract. Okay, and so what's happening here is that this is the so-called instability strip that I talked about earlier. So stars that are in that instability strip tend to pulsate, and that stars that are in the lower edge of the instability strip are our Lyra variables. Stars that are in the upper edge of the instability strip are your Cepheid variables, and then nearby are the long period variables like Mira. Mira will expand and contract and change in brightness drastically. And so we've already talked about all of these sort of things with variable stars, pulsating variables, when we were talking about the HR diagram. So I'm not going to really go over this again because I've already done that, but this is the part of the book where it goes into a little bit of discussion about it. I went into actually more discussion than the book did, so I went into greater detail, and I did it associated with the earlier chapter rather than this one. So you can go back and look, if you'd like, at the lectures I did at that point. But I thought I would go ahead and mention them because it does matter right now because your book talks about it. Your book also uses this as your opportunity to talk about populations of stars, population 1 and population 2 stars. It talks about that also in this chapter. And here, for example, we have a sample spectrum between a metal poor star on the top and a metal rich star on the bottom. The metal rich star, you have more spectral lines. Remember, a metal is anything that's other than hydrogen and helium. And again, it makes sense to me to talk about this when we're talking about the HR diagram and the spectrum of stars. That really made a whole lot more sense to me than to squeeze this into a section here of the book here. Okay, that's much later. Now, why are this different? Well, remember, these metals actually occur, in nuclear fusion. We have hydrogen fuses and helium. The universe, we believe, started off as hydrogen and helium. And so the hydrogen fuses into more helium. But then we discovered that in certain stars, when they get really old, the helium will fuse into carbon. Well, we're going to later find out that for really high mass stars, the carbon will start fusing into other things. And so that's where all these things come from. So the stars that are very poor in metals, they formed out of interstellar medium that did not have all these other things in it. The stars that are very rich in metals formed from the interstellar medium that had all these other things. The other things came from fusion in stars. So that means that these other stars had to have lived and died and enriched the interstellar medium. We'll talk about how that happens later. But this kind of gets you an idea of the stellar evolution processes that happen in stars. And again, we're now kind of tying in some of these concepts that we had mentioned earlier in the semester. we're bringing these concepts into our discussion now of stars and stellar evolution. And so hopefully this kind of ties what we're doing now into what came before, because this is really not a really, separate concept. This is just tying together some of the loose ends.